Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Red Light Exposé, a podcast that aims to shine a light on the sex trade and the sex industry from women who have been part of the industry and also women who are concerned about the happenings within the industry as well. My name is Savannah. Some of you may already know me as one of the podcast hosts on the Female Dating Strategy podcast, and I am delighted to be sharing this episode with two other fabulous guests. So I will hand over to Jo to quickly introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Sybil Jo, and I'm coming from good old Bible Belt, USA. I spent 15 years in the sex industry and in different fields. I'm a mother of three. Just really excited to be here talking to these brilliant ladies. I think we're gonna get into some really good stuff today. Merle?
Hi, my name is Merle. I am calling from Sweden. A little about me, I am a political scientist. I am attempting to write a book, and when I work, I usually do different lectures talking about my time in the sex industry. I was in the sex industry from the time I was 14 till 30, and just trying to make sense of it all, how we can move forward.
Wonderful, ladies. Thank you so much for that. So, getting into this episode, the topic of this episode is sugar babies. So, when we were planning for this episode, we came up with a lot of topics and ideas that we wanted to cover under this umbrella because it is an incredibly broad topic. But essentially, let's start with the basics. So, a sugar baby is a woman, generally a younger woman, but older women can also be sugar babies too, as I found in my research, who is essentially in a relationship with an older, wealthier man, and they exchange money. So there's several different components to this sort of dynamic, but what we wanted to touch on today specifically is the danger behind almost repackaging this sort of relationship as a viable career option for women, especially younger women, especially younger impoverished women, and B, the impact this sort of dynamic has on relationships outside the sex industry and even within the sex industry itself.
What I would like to say from the point of view of Sweden, who is being held pretty high in esteem when it comes to the sex industry, fighting the sex industry, we have a major problem with sugar daddies and sugar babes and the repackaging. One of the first things that everyone noticed was when there was this big website released in Sweden, and they planted these big trucks outside of our universities, our schools, basically saying, we're starting this site, register today, and there was like no security. And we did a test from the organization I was currently on, just asking the question like, would you date someone under the age of 15? Would you, all those, just trying to make sense of this website. And was very shocking. And so we're not in the dark about this in Sweden. The Swedish police are pretty clear about that there's no difference between sugar babes and prostitution. And me as a former exited prostitute, I can say that we do this all the time. We do prostitutes, and then it was escorts. Now we're into sugar babes. It's the same thing, and it's just equally as harmful.
Yeah. So where I'm at, everything is criminalized, but not really enforced. It's kind of the cops will go after the low hanging fruit so that they can go on the news and say that they did something. But really, pretty much everything is just in the shadow side. Like everybody kind of knows it's an open secret. I'm in a real tourist area, so there's a lot of poor locals and a lot of money coming through, and so there's a strip club on every block just about in town. I actually have been kind of just out of the conversation for a while, for maybe like 10 years. So I said to myself, well, I wonder what people are saying about sugaring relationships right now in 2024. And I just did a little Googling. I found some sugaring Reddits, which I've never messed with Reddit. So it's an interesting place. But one comment, a guy was talking about like how to find sugar babies. He's interested in this kind of relationship. And somebody said, you can often convert dancers if you're a decent person and spend enough. You can also try Tinder. Just set your age to below 30, and the only girls matching you will be the bots trying to steal from you and the occasional girl looking for a sugar daddy. So that really, really rung for me the going to the strip clubs, because I did work in the strip clubs in my area when I was younger before I went into full on escorting. And I definitely saw that a lot, regular quote unquote customers coming in and finding a girl and then she's his girl for a while. And it's all very informal.
And so that is quite interesting because it speaks to almost the way in which, even though they like to style it as a loving relationship, which is like, what sugar babies and sugar daddies tend to convince themselves that it is, but they still tend to prey on women who are clearly in very, very vulnerable and desperate situations, such as, women at a strip club, for example.
Again, it's the open secret. They know, and we know, but we're supposed to pretend like we don't. And we just keep telling this story. The other thing, so like I said, I just typed in sugaring relationships into Google. The first thing that popped up was an article from Forbes magazine. And I was like, oh, this is about as mainstream as it gets.
Yes. Yeah. Wow, Forbes. Okay, yeah.
What and my first note was, oh, good Lord Almighty, I don't even know where to start in this article. I'm getting indigestion from this. I can read some of that.
Yes, yeah, go for it.
Sugaring relationships refer to mutually beneficial arrangements between two individuals where one person, often older and financially established, colloquially referred to as a sugar daddy or sugar mommy.
Okay, stop the bus.
Provides financial support.
Stop the bus. Sorry to interrupt. I think the way that Forbes has framed this from the outset is incredibly dangerous. So a lot of even, sites like Seeking Arrangements, which is where I guess it's like the den of the sugaring website, they'll frame it as something that is mutually beneficial in quotation marks. But if you actually look at the setup of these relationships, it very quickly becomes apparent that the benefits are heavily one-sided. So, okay, the man, he could be putting down substantial sums of money when actually really a lot of men in the sugar bowl, as they call it. So the bowl is where people, go to look for sugar relationships. So sugar daddies and sugar babies go to look for relationships. The bowl is heavily saturated with basically cheap johns. And men have clocked that if you basically try to style it as a relationship, they can basically get an escort or a prostitute at a discount.
Yes.
So then what ends up happening is that these women are generally young. And I feel like when, like you don't have to be in the sex trade for this to also apply to you as well. I feel like when you're generally young, or even if you dangle money in front of a lot of people, right, their boundaries will become a lot more flexible. If you think of in your typical job at, say, for example, Starbucks, when you are dependent on that job to pay your bills and to live, you tend to put up with a lot more crap than if, they weren't paying your bills, for example. And the sugar daddies, they will leverage this dynamic to their advantage. So, what you end up having is, men who are skilled in manipulating and using women sexually. And you then have these women who tend to be quite naive, tend to be quite young, and tend to be either desperate for money or just wanting more money. They then try to package that as a mutually beneficial relationship, even though it's the woman who ends up being required to give a lot more for the dynamic to continue.
I agree. I agree with you both. And when you're a young woman, because they're not really pandering to young men as big as they pandering to young women and girls. And if you look at it, ask yourself, what are they asking me to do? And there's no, in no reality, there's no sugar dating that doesn't involve sex, that doesn't involve giving access and giving away your bodily autonomy. Even though you can read articles where they say, the interview in Sweden, it would be Lisa, she's 18 years old and she doesn't pay any intuition, or, she just lives this very glamorous lifestyle, which is never really true, honestly, when they start talking. And it's like, what are you aspiring? Are you aspiring social climbing, a glamorous lifestyle? Sugar dating will never be it. And the reason why sugar dating will never be it is because the whole pretty woman narrative that is being sold, the packaging is something, but the content is another. Look at what are you being asked to do. Are you being asked to be on call for this person, to just have dinners and sit down? Then be a personal coach, be a personal whatever, all of those, hobby psychologists. But that's not what it is. And I can see in the Swedish media, especially when they started to launching all these websites, that when you boil it down, no matter how you package it, it's always about sex. A friend of mine used to say, everything's about sex in society except sex, which is about power. It's a quote from someone. I'm sorry that I don't quote my source here, but it's very true, and especially when it comes to this. I've spent a lot of time in the gay community. They've had this for just as long. I see this in the prostitute communities. Of survivors being either active or non-active. I see this in, these girl groups on Facebook who has about around 100,000 members. And it's never, ever working out the way it's being sold. And need to follow up on those interviews. If I could, I would, but often it's anonymous. Follow up. What really happened? Did you social climb? Did you live that glamorous lifestyle? Did you get your boobs done and whatever? Because just superficial happiness is very appealing, I would say. For me as a young girl, it was very appealing. Even though I didn't enter the sex trade on my own accord, being in there, by the time I was around 18 and 19, having, regulars that came and, you could pay your bills by meeting them. You could even get like a trip somewhere. It doesn't say that there's no disclaimer that there is on cigarettes that this is just as harmful as when you have a customer that comes in for 15 minutes. You just don't see it yet because society has framed this as something socially acceptable. And it really isn't. It's just as much prostitution as ever.
Yeah, totally. What you just said about the oh well, it doesn't necessarily have to do with sex. There was another interview that I listened to. There was a sugar baby guest being interviewed, and she kind of started to say, sex is never expected. And then she stopped herself. It was really interesting. And she like backtracked. And it was almost like she couldn't say the lie that boldly. And she had to like kind of and she was like, sex is often not expected. Like she changed her wording because to say sex is never expected is so laughable because she knows it's always expected. Yes, of course. And they always talk about you go out on a date, you have dinner, you see if you have chemistry. And if you don't have chemistry, that's okay. You don't have to have sex. What they don't say is he's never going to call you back. You're not getting another cent from him. And if, but I remember selling this when I was in it too. I didn't do the sugaring, but when I would tell people about my job, I remember emphasizing the desire for companionship and intelligent conversation in my Johns, and like, telling other people that, most of my Johns are just looking for intimacy. And this seems to be what the sugaring folks are selling. I think that women who aren't in it really want to believe that story because they have husbands, fathers, brothers who buy women, and so they want to think like, oh, well, my men are going for this kind of intimacy, and it's not really about the sex. And so all the Johns and pimps have to do is tell that lie that everyone wants to hear, and it becomes gospel. And Savannah, what you had said about the mutually beneficial, I did not find a single article or interview or anything that was supposed to be objective that did not have that phrase in it. So I picked it up as it's really a slogan. It's really a mantra that they keep saying over and over again.
It's almost like it's like propaganda and false advertising.
It is, yeah.
Because if anyone, and it's not even just in this article, it's not the first time I've heard it. I've been down the rabbit hole on various forums for sugar babies, and I feel like a lot of them are downplaying the amount of sexual activity that is actually expected of them. A lot of them would have you believe that these men are giving them thousands of dollars in cash, in gifts, just by going, for dinner dates, when actually it's not about the dinner or even the company. It is the fact that these men, the way they see it, they literally see it as buying access to a woman who otherwise would not give them the time of day.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, they really want to play up this like, this kind of desire for a well-educated, well-turned-out, kind of erudite concubine, and then like he's really there because there's chemistry and she's so intelligent. He just loves being around her, and she's so rare. How rare to find such a good woman. No, there's plenty of women who will give that kind of companionship model and the porn star model. He's not going to go and spend hundreds of dollars to get one when he could spend the same amount to get both. And that's just how markets work.
Yeah, and also to just circle around to the power dynamic of it all, because I'm listening to you, both of you, and I just want to hear your opinion about this, because during both my experience in prostitution, but also in relationship with men, I found that you don't really get to know the person until you start saying no.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you see what the power dynamic is. A good friend of mine told me that, oh, Merle, what's the difference really? Like, is it like we talked about, sugar dating, maybe more as the forms that being described by the general media than we do now as prostitution. And she was like, but isn't all marriages and all relationships prostitution if we go by your definition of it? And I said, well, it's all about when you start saying no, then what happens? So you go when we look at sugar dating, you go on a couple of dates with this guy. He treats you to really nice restaurants for most part. And I must say this to stress this to anyone who's listening. It's just one date, but I'm going to paint the picture now. You go on a couple of dates, and there's an hotel room booked on the third date, let's say. You don't feel like it. What happens if you say no? Will he call you again? Will he still treat you to all these things? There's no, and I must stress this because I've seen in the community of feminists that there is this, they try to make sense of the sugar dating in a way that makes it almost sound like people are objecting to it because it's just about money grabbing, women and girls who just want to be rich. And, being a leftist, that's offensive in itself for some feminists. So we don't treat them with the same, maybe, empathy as we do to regular survivors. But by looking at the power dynamics, regardless if we're talking about a relationship, regardless if we're talking about sugar dating, it's about saying no. And I've had clients who wanted to post themselves off as sugar daddies. It was just more about getting control of you. It was more about being able to reach you and being able to control what you were doing with your time. So you spent it on them rather than just having a quickie and then you could just close the door and, move on and do whatever you wanted to do. Even in a relationship, if I was in a relationship with a man and we have great 2 years. If I, after 2 years, says I don't want to have sex and he rapes me, uh, it's the same thing. It's part of the same really misogynistic structure where it's just about control. And it's just about being, like you said, Joe, the porn happy, always saying yes, always grateful for just being chosen, that you always feel obliged. Sugar babies are definitely part of like this bigger pattern. But I would like to hear what you're saying about the power structure. What do you think about the powers that be?
It's really funny, Savannah, both of you have brought up things already that I clocked in this article. And when you said it's like propaganda, it's like an advertisement. I mean, it really, and like you're saying, is he really going to call you back? What's his actual attitude about that? And again, going back and reading what these guys say to each other on their forums, another Reddit user commented, I think they were having some conversation about a sugar baby having emotional problems or like whatever. And he says, it's like having a sex worker on retainer. He's not paying for her shit just to have to deal with her emotional neediness. He's paying for a compliant little fuck toy. I mean, Forbes can say whatever they want. They can say mutually beneficial all they want. But then when you look at when they're talking to each other, this is the language they use.
It's clearly a transaction. And the general sugaring discourse, even within the world of prostitution, right? You know how there's like that legal fiction almost where to get around the illegalities of prostitution, a lot of, women or people working in the industry will say you're paying for their time. When it's like, technically that might be true, but it's not like these Johns are just paying to be in the same room as a woman and basically stare at her. I mean, there are probably some men that do that, but they are in the minuscule minority. What they are paying for is access to her body and sex. They're not paying for her time per se. And a lot of these women, again, they'll know that if they don't have sex for whatever reason, they're not getting paid. If you're genuinely paid for your time, right, if you decided not to have sex, then you would still get paid. The fact that the time is, predicated on sexual activity taking place is evident that you are being paid for sex. And that's it.
Right. That's a great point. That's a great point. All of the sex work is work.
Yeah.
Well, which part is the work? It's the sex. So you can say, yeah, sure, you can choose not to have sex and you can choose not to get paid for your job.
Exactly. Like,
that's not how work works. Like you can't, you have to go to your job so you can pay your bills.
But yeah, I'm surprised that, well, I'm not really surprised, but I am sort of, the economics of cost of living crisis would be very interesting to analyze from a gender perspective, especially the disproportionate impact on women. But I feel like this is an example of it disproportionately impacting women because it tends to be women who are targeted for these sorts of arrangements. I remember there was quite a disgusting John forum on Reddit. I think that Reddit have actually cleansed a lot of their John subreddits because they've gone public. Anyway, in the tech layoffs in California, a lot of them were saying how this is now a good opportunity to find a woman in that area who's desperate, who's, just lost her job. And I just remember thinking, like, what fucking vultures? I mean, but they would never say something like, I'm going to go and stand outside Google, the Google buildings and accost all women, who come into that building, knowing that generally speaking, people who work at something like Google are paid really, really well, and see if they want to be my sugar baby. No, they always go for
the most vulnerable
and the women they deem to be desperate.
Mm-hmm. We had the same thing when the war in Ukraine broke out. I remember there was this comedian, a male comedian in Greece, I think. He said something like, well, now we're going to get to, be able to purchase a lot of beautiful Ukrainian women. It only took like a month before Pornhub had that in the title of one of their most popular movies. Or genres, if you may.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that. That was on my radar at that time. It drains the blood from my limbs just thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes we have the tendency to, not we, but the general population have the tendency to act like, well, men are not really aware what women, go through and how they are, being treated. And I'm letting tell you, I did a thing for theater production a couple of years back, who asked me, because it was about it was a monologue with a woman in prostitution, and they asked me to do a 10-15 minute before, just reading for the audience a couple of my experiences. And and what I wanted to do was also to read what men said about girls and women in the sex trade online. So I went online and I got all these sort of reviews from John's, and it was a horror show, as you probably know. But one of the most things that stood out to me was one review that wasn't really a review. It was a review of the so-called work itself, where he said, "When how stupid are women if they think that they can do this without getting hurt? I mean, this is a dangerous profession." And I was like, yeah, so you do know. You do know. And one of the, most aggressive sort of like pro-sex lobby would say, but now you're talking about prostitution again. We are talking about sugar. It's the same people. It's the same people in both like in both genres. There's no line here that needs to be drawn. That's why I keep going back and forth. But it was just a really chilling experience going around and reading, because I've met plenty of Johns who said like, "Oh, I read your reviews online," and I've never ever felt the need to go there and look it up. But just being very, very aware that they are just as aware on how they're treated, and that's why when we're talking about sugar daddies being, disappointed because they're not trying to buy anyone. They just want to have some beauty in their lives and someone to share it with. It's like they know exactly what they're doing. There's never that's not a thing, really. In fact, we've had several cases in Sweden where they've been convicted of rape. Of course, being convicted of buying sex, but also being convicted of rape, because what they do is that they go in online and they pose as, wealthy men, and then they just rape the girl that shows up. And someone say was like, you don't have to rape her if it was all agreed upon. No, but if you're like a man in that way, that you get off on this, you get off on the power dynamic, and you know that like this particular man that I'm talking about, I think raped something like 30 women and girls. It's like he doesn't have what he's been saying. He doesn't have the big boat and all the money for luxury, so he just goes straight for the rape. There's so many lies being told that just needs to be flushed down the toilet, because everyone knows that it's a lie, but maybe not the most vulnerable one, and that's the one we need to be looking after.
Yeah. And I think what you keep saying about it's the same thing, it's the same thing. And this goes across so many really artificial boundaries that we kind of make up in our language about sexual abuse, period. Just male sexual violence against women and children. And it's the same techniques, it's the same abuse, whether it's like you said, the man who has the money and can get the porn star on his arm, he'll do it to her. The man who doesn't have the money, he'll find someone else to do it to. But it's the same abuse.
It is. I can't even really understand how we came to look at it in another way. But I used to say that there's a reason why we don't call drug dealers pharmacists.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like this is the same thing as prostitution. This is not a different kind of, so-called work. It's the same thing. As so much so that a lot of times when I look back at my 16 years in the sex trade, there was a lot of men posing. They wouldn't use the word sugar baby, but sugar daddy, but they would pose as them, note for note, when contacting me. Also wanting to separate themselves from the other buyers, the other Johns, the other men, saying that, oh, well, I'm not just in for a quickie and I'm not going to treat you bad. One of them took me to Gran Canaria, and he was probably one of the more long-lasting men in my life that bought me. And the second we got there, because I was in a really bad shape and I was currently coming down from drug use and everything, so I was not in the mood for anything. But the second we locked that hotel room, and I said no to him. You get all this thrown at you. I've paid for this trip. You're being ungrateful. Like you're just in this sort of paradise hell where you can't go anywhere. He's got your plane tickets. He's got everything. He's got all the money for going back and forth to the airport. And you just feel like I have to stay here with him throughout the trip and be his. Or otherwise he will be. He did eventually get violent with me, but this is not just one off. It's so many women who shares the same experience. What happens when you say no? And it's not something that we see a lot in the media. I would love for media to take the role a little bit more serious when it comes to sugar dating and not act as the just being, this is an interesting new thing. And we don't at all look at this as commercial, dangers when we spread like false advertising for these websites and this sort of clientele. I would love to see them take it a little bit more seriously, maybe talk a little bit more about both the power structure, but the long-term effects. Also, can we see a list? Like if Forbes want to write about this, can I see a list about sugar babies under 30 who's actually social climbed through their sugar dating services? Because I don't think that's going to be a very long list at all.
Yeah, and the thing about the media though is it's run and owned by the pimps. I mean, I think what Gail Dines is always hammering in about, this is not a mom and pop operation. This is really the biggest global industry on the planet, and the banks are in it, the hotels are in it, everybody's got their finger in it, either as a seller or a consumer. And so of course Forbes is advertising. It's all an advertisement. And that's, like I think you said, like, why have we come to this idea that this is acceptable, that this is okay? Well, because they're putting billions and billions and billions of dollars into advertising for decades.
It comes in nicely, just off the back of what you're saying, Sybil Jo, comes in nicely with the cost of living crisis. When you sort of come out of high school and then, life starts getting serious and then you start having financial responsibilities and stuff like that, you're going to look at that and think, okay, that doesn't sound too bad. Like I could, find a gentleman who is older than me, who I'm not necessarily physically attracted to, but I can pretend that I am in order to get a paycheck. And you see these women dedicating their entire lives to trying to find this golden unicorn of a sugar daddy. And I always observe them from a distance. And I just think if you just invested a fraction of the time you are investing into finding a sugar daddy into yourself, you would be a lot further ahead. You wouldn't need to probably get into sugaring, and you'd ultimately be a lot happier as well. Because essentially, if a woman is pursuing a sugaring relationship, she is pursuing prostitution. And I've noticed that sugar daddies, they like to play with semantics. So what they'll say is, sugaring isn't sex work, like I'm not looking for an escort and stuff like that. And because the sorts of women that are looking for these arrangements, they feel somehow about being labelled as a sex worker. They believe what these men say when they don't see them as sex workers. However, these men will then turn around and say, but intimacy is expected by the third day. So basically sex is expected by the third day, otherwise I'm out. You sort of have that contradiction, but because they also know that women are desperate not to be seen as that dirty hooker, for example, excuse my language, they will basically manipulate the semantics so that they always win.
Yeah, we used to call it the whorearchy.
Yes, that's it. Yes.
Strippers will say, well, at least I'm not an escort. And sugar babies will say, well, at least I'm not a stripper.
And then women in prostitution say things like, at least I don't do bare services, or
Right.
at least I'm not a
Right.
streetwalker.
Exactly. And we all have our own little boxes that we feel comfortable. We're like, okay, this is the story that makes me feel comfortable. And so they create these different little stories for whatever that young woman needs to hear to get her to do the same thing.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. And also, like, in a healthy society, this is what is mind-boggling to me when it comes to both what the babies are saying, the ones that are completely caught up in it and are advocating for it, and sugar daddies and all of them. But in a healthy society, is like, would this even be a thing in an equal society, that you have one side that is being paid to perform sexually and socially just so that they will be able to pay the rent? And I just, for me, it's a bit mind-boggling that it's okay, like that it's seen through the lens of an equal opportunity deal.
But at the same time, Merle, you said something earlier about somebody saying, well, by your definition, marriage is prostitution. And it's I've heard people say that, and I'm like, you're so close.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you say, like, how are we at this point? But at the same time, isn't this what our foremothers have been doing to survive forever
Yeah.
and ever? At least 10,000 years in one form or
Don't you be
another.
talking about my grandma. No, but that's kidding. Yeah, but of course.
But whether it's in like I said, whichever little hole you get put in, whether you're the good wife, the long suffering, stand by your man, or and going back, Savannah, you keep coming back to, they're targeting desperate women, and Andrea Dworkin really connected this for me. Like, reading her, she really put it together for me that this is what the structure is built on. This is why women have to be kept poor. And when you look at most areas, in my
Mm-hmm.
area, certainly, I look at the statistics of people living in poverty, and it's all women and children. Why is that?
Yeah.
Well, then there's this open pool of desperate young women, and like I said earlier, he's not going to go out and find a woman who says no when he can go down the block, and there's going to be a woman who needs to say yes, and they know how to find them.
When women in prostitution are defending the sex industry, they always compare it to a menial job that is generally underpaid anyway. So things like cleaning or working in a factory. I'm yet to see a woman ever compare being a sex worker, in quotation marks, to working as a director or as an administrator. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They always compare it to jobs, or companies where they've been exploited. It's not like for like. And it's like you're sort of comparing shit to shit and saying that the shit you've been served is better than the other available shit. Like, but that's not always like the case.
Well, and that was absolutely my point of view when I was in it. That was my line completely. I was like, this affords me freedom. This gives me, I could be working at flipping burgers, making $9 an hour, or I can work 1 week a month.
And again, it's like sort of short-sighted, because especially with the rise of remote working and flexible working, like I know in my job, for example, it's officially 9 to 5, but depending on my day and what's happening, I can do 2 till 6. There's some days where it's so quiet I don't do a lot of work at all. So again, this sort of lie that the only form of flexible working for women can be found in the sex industry is not true, and anyone who is self-employed will tell you that. I mean, yes, they legally work for themselves, but if they want to make any decent money, they have to be available when the customer is. If that's 10 p.m. at night, then if you want to get paid, you have to be up. If that's 6 a.m. in the morning, but at least with an employer, right, it's generally set hours. Like, that, or at least I know, as soon as it gets to 6 o'clock on a Friday, I can shut my laptop and ignore everything else, and I still get paid, right? But
it's not.
In the sex industry and in prostitution, that security just isn't there.
I guess the only security, and the way I saw it, was the demand is there. Like I always knew that no matter what, There's a niche for that. Like, even if, I'm 40 years old, I could walk out today and find somebody. The demand is just
But speaking of demand,
ubiquitous.
when it comes to sugar dating as well as sex trade, in the big picture way of talking about it, how much do you think being able to separate yourself as one who is being wanted, demanded, you are being told constantly that you are attractive, you are sexy, that's that world. But then you look at the big picture in the community, the society, and it's the same thing. We value that. We say that, oh, it's harder to get jobs, which it is. If you're overweight or if you're unattractive, if you as a woman speak too much, talk too much, and being very, outgoing, there's a certain standard, a certain norm that we look upon in society and saying that that's attractive. And how far is that from saying that's attractive to that's actually something that we think you should monetize, that should be for sale? Because I'm born the same year as Joe. I am born 85, so I lived through the 90s. I lived through the 10s, the ooze, and I saw constantly how being a beautiful girl or woman was being monetized and valued, high price valued. You have the Playboy models, you have the, all that different newspapers, where you could, flaunt your perfect body. And I'm not saying that I ever had a perfect body, but looking back, say 20 years ago, me sitting there thinking that I look so good and men wants to buy this when I was, 20s, 21 something, and try to legitimize this for myself. It was also what I've been taught was something that could be monetized. So my question is, how much, if you look at, the media and the society's role in actually legitimizing, monetizing on our bodies, our autonomous, but especially, the female beauty, the male gaze, if you may. Do you think that the society plays a role in that by having those values?
Well, and like you say, you go out in a 9 to 5 job, those qualities are going to benefit you. I know that if I'm a bartender, and I've got a dude bartender with me, like, I can wear a low cut shirt, I can make some good tips. And really, when I was 18 and I decided to start working at strip clubs, it was a big part of it because I was working at a diner, I was waiting tables, and I was getting sexually harassed every day by dirty old men. And I was like, if I'm going to be doing this, I want to be getting compensated better. This is happening to me in my everyday life. And it felt like going towards it explicitly was the smarter, at least I can make a buck.
It's almost like being a sugar baby has become almost like the neo sex work. When it's not cool to be an escort anymore, it's not cool to be a stripper anymore, you can just say you're a sugar baby or a companion. But ultimately, it comes back to the same dynamics. It comes back to the same economic influences that drives women to do this stuff. I mean, again, if a woman was on track to becoming a genuinely, you get the odd, woman who presents, or they essentially say that they're high achieving in their careers, and I don't doubt there are probably a few of them who are sugar babies, but exception doesn't disprove the general rule. If the vast majority of women, felt like they had a fair shot in the world, whether that be in terms of education or in terms of social mobility, it's unlikely that a lot of them would be signing up to these sorts of oppressive arrangements as well.
I'm in complete agreement, but I think that, as I stated earlier, that we need to look at society to fix this problem, not fix it for us. The problem is, of course, the sugar daddies, but they are a product of the society they are working in and living in and actually growing up in. And if we're going to reach some sort of way to reach some equality ever, we need to start really seriously work with that. Not just work with men, because men is if I may, the core of the problem. But we are helping that core a lot, I can see, when it comes to advocating for superficial beauty. The younger, the better, the less experienced, the better, the pretty woman complex, that rich guy that's going to come and save you on a white horse. So as a society, we need to take a good hard look at, as I said, Savannah, the oppression, their vulnerabilities that we submit people to, and say that that's never acceptable.
I think for me, a big takeaway is looking more deeply at the stories that we tell. And again, the way that we differentiate. We tell one story about a sugar baby. We tell a different story about an escort. We tell a different story about a wife who's in a coercively controlling marriage. My ask for listeners, and especially like who I want to talk to, is women who haven't been in it and who maybe have like some inkling, but they don't really, they haven't looked deeply into these stories. And I would say, if you're a liberal feminist, or if you're, just kind of, you don't have to take our word for it right away, but keep listening and looking more deeply into, asking more questions and looking more deeply into each of these different kinds of stories. And you'll start to see the common thread that runs through all of them. And, I really think, Marley, I think you said something about, we can't count on the men. One of my big questions is, like, I understand why the men believe it and why they tell these stories. Why do the women want to believe these stories? And how do we open up that dialogue and shed some light on what's going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, I would just say, generally on this topic, I feel like, especially living in a social media age, it is very, very easy to get caught up in the highlights of people's, lives, right? But it can take some critical thinking and understanding to acknowledge that the way people present situations, particularly when it comes to sex work, and particularly where men have a vested interest in keeping women in as many women as possible in a certain place where they can access them to exploit them, it's just important to acknowledge that even within a sugar baby dynamic, even when women are in quotation marks choosing this path, when they're expressing independent, when they're showing, it still goes back to that same model of sexual exploitation. And that's what we really need to be calling it. When we call it a sugar relationship or a sugar baby, we are almost, on pain of sound like a hypocrite, because I've used that terminology all throughout this episode, but we are sanitizing what is essentially sexual exploitation. And if it's a commitment to myself and to listeners as well, just to call it what it is and just say it's a sexually exploitative relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you for saying that, Savannah. That really that hit my heart. I appreciate that a lot as a survivor.
Me too, very much. So we are now going to end this episode. Savannah, you talked us into this. I'm going to talk us out. Thank you for listening. There's more episodes to come, not necessarily with us, but with other active members of Red Light Exposé. So until next time.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.